Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you in our new podcast by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, Planet Profit. Welcome back to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. In this episode, we're going to get foliar disease update across Cornelius Country as we hit critical growth stages in corn and soybeans, and we'll also discuss if it pays to spray. So, good morning, Craig.
Good morning, Juan.
Well, I know you've been on the road quite a bit here lately, and you're actually going to get back on the road again as soon as we wrap this up. Overall, can you kind of give us an update on how what the crop conditions are and what you've been seeing across the areas you've traveled?
Yeah, across our footprint in general, crops look very good. I guess kind of scary good. As I talk to customers, we've had good looking crops and then had the wheels falling off before, kind of like we did in West Central Illinois last year. But things that I've seen so far look great. Corn, exceptional. We've had nice rains here. Had some dry areas in June, which is not always bad to get the roots really rooted down. And now we've had rains across most of our footprint, and so corn's pretty lush. Heading into a tasseling time frame. Central Illinois, we're well tasseled now. Probably done pollinating in most cases, or pretty close to it. And then as we work our way north and some of the later plantings, we're getting close. So beans, as poor as beans looked, 3-4 weeks ago, just they were kind of going through that ugly stage, late planted soybeans, and corn was looking really good in comparison. They're definitely catching up now. They're not as tall as we would think they should be at this time of the year, but with the later planting, in a lot of cases, they're probably at a pretty normal height, but well into R2 stage, pretty much everywhere. Some early R3 coming around, probably not R3 yet, because probably just a few plants here and there that have hit that stage, and you need 50% of the plants in a field to be at that stage to consider it there. But they are coming along, and beans, where they're indeterminate, they're going to continue to put nodes on and continue to grow while they're flowering and potting. So I think they're going to be in pretty good shape when it's all said and done.
Right, and with that being said, and I don't want to jump too quick into fungicide timings, because it sounds like good timings for that on soybeans is when they're at the R3 stage, and for corn you're looking at that VT to R1 stage, that tasseling to silking. How has foliar feeding looked across the crop that you have seen?
Well, some people like to stick a foliar feed in with a fungicide, at that time frame. A lot of times with corn, it's just maybe a nitrogen, and with soybeans and some other micronutrients. And I guess I can find studies that show that doesn't pay very often, and you can find studies that show it pays. So it's kind of a personal, a personal opinion on what you want to do with your program there. But when you're already going over the acre with a fungicide, it makes that cost, it doesn't add any additional application cost to throw in a micronutrient. So I think that's why people like to do that. One of the other things I've seen also just recently is areas that have had wind events with some green snap. And just to review on that, we have 2 periods during the corn's growth stage that are susceptible to green snap. First one is V5 to V8. So that's a time when we really don't like to see heavy storms move through. And I was in a plot in east central Iowa last week, and you can still see where those plants are snapped off from that early stage, because V5 to V8 you're talking knee-high corn, but those carcasses are still there, so you can still tell when that happened. But the second stage is the one we're dealing with now, is V12 to tassel. So V12 is about shoulder high, and so from that time frame until that plant starts to throw tassels, it's still pretty susceptible to green snap. You've got rapid elongation of the cells, and those nodes are pretty brittle. So we have seen some of that. Now, when you have a wind event move through, you can tell when you've got corn that's root lodged, because you can see that from the road, or get up in the air and see that. But you need to get out in that field if you're going to see the green snap. And a lot of times the later green snap, it might happen at the fourth or fifth node up, and that's just a frustrating thing to see when you got an almost fully developed plant and it snaps off, and that yield potential is gone at that point. So
yeah, it is, that it feels like it's been exceptionally windy, or we hear about more wind events more often now than we do in the past. And I was just, as you've told us before, that any of these foliar diseases can move with the wind, and so kind of a good segue for us into some of that fungicide application timings and whatnot. Currently with corn and soybean growth stages, with them being at the critical periods right now, when folks are considering these foliar fungicide applications, the big question whether or not to pull the trigger is if the conditions that we have had recently warrant their application. We've had some more humid days, and some areas got some moisture. How do you feel those conditions favor these decisions?
Well, it's a good question. It's a big question. There's a lot of different aspects to it, but we always go back to the disease triangle. So the disease triangle is having a susceptible host, which is corn, and then the disease present, and that can vary. The disease present question, when we talk about gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, tar spot, things like that overwinter on our residue at the soil surface, those pathogens are always going to be present. But as you mentioned, the rusts, both common and southern rust, they do not overwinter in the north. They have to be, or they'll be overwintering in a tropical environment. So they have to blow up here in storms. Those spores do, and we have not had a lot of southern originated storms. Every time we get a storm this time of the year, I'm watching where it comes from, because I want to see if there's a possibility that rust has come up on those storms, and they've still been originating basically from the west, from the northwest. And in my travels this week, I think I saw 2, 3, maybe pustules of common rust, and so that kind of underscores that just has not been a big issue that we've had. And those pustules had not. I would say they were dead. I'd say they had not went ahead and respored, because when we get hot and dry weather, that pretty much stops the rust. So we had some hot, dry weather before we got into our current conditions, and I would say that's pretty much put a stop to it. So we'll still be looking for southern rust in particular later on here in the summer, as we get warmer and moist, and if we have storms coming up from the south. But I think our common rust is probably pretty much done. So the conditions that we've had recently, though, we always have gray leaf spot. We've got corn as the susceptible host, and so we just need the environment. And the environment for gray leaf spot, which is always our worst disease, is warm conditions, high humidity, leaf wetness. So as we've had these uncomfortable human conditions, high humidity, warm conditions, we see a lot of heavy dews in the mornings. When we get out scout fields in the morning, we just get saturated pretty much. Fogs, even we've had fogs in the morning. So we have really perfect conditions for gray leaf to go ahead and get going. I haven't seen a lot of it. There's not a lot of it out there in the field right now, but those conditions tell me that it's going to go ahead and blow up and get in our crop pretty good from this point on out. So the fungicide applications that we see going on, probably a money well spent, because I think we've got ripe conditions to get gray leaf going.
Is it safe to assume that we'll probably see that more in continuous corn, no-till type situations?
The answer is yes, just because you have more residue there. But in today's agriculture across our footprint, we have a ton of either no-till soybeans, or our tillage that we do still leaves a lot of residue on the surface. So yes, you might see a little more gray leaf spot and continuous corn, but it's not going to be tremendous amount more because we still have a lot of corn residue from the 2 years ahead, um, that had a year of soybeans on it. So that pathogen is present pretty much in all of our soils.
What about for soybeans?
Well, on the soybean, and I think just as a general concept here, what are we trying to do with fungicides is the question. And obviously, first control funguses that may cause us, that may rob yield. But as we look at our timing and the timing that we want to put both the corn and the soybeans on, that's developed through trials of this is where I get the highest yield. Well, do you get the highest yield because you're controlling a certain disease at that time, or are you getting it because you are controlling stress on that crop at a unique time? I would argue it's the latter. I mean, we always will get benefit from controlling the disease, but the reason we do an R1 application on corn is because the strobilurin family of fungicides that are in there they act as a stress relief. So if we relieve stress at that particular time when we're soaking, when we're pollinating that ear, we're going to do two things. We're going to keep from boarding kernels on the tip, and we're also going to really increase our kernel depth. Those first couple weeks after pollination are really important on kernel depth, and if we can have a stress-free plant, that's really going to increase that. The same thing with soybeans. R3 is the stage that we have proven is the highest yielding for a fungicide application. So if that strobilurin is on there and it's reducing stress in that soybean plant, that's at a critical time period, R3. Generally, R3 is, right around last little bit in July, first week in August. That obviously can fluctuate depending on the year. But that's a time frame that's usually pretty stressful. It's usually pretty hot, pretty dry. It's a critical time in that plant's life. So if we can reduce that stress and prevent flowers from aborting or early pods that have developed from aborting, then that's when we're going to gain yield. So that's why the timing on those things. Now, I've heard some arguments here recently of are we in R2, R3. I don't think we're R3 yet. I know some people have pulled the trigger on applications because of that, but you remember R3 is going to have a pod 3/16 of an inch long at one of the four upper nodes that has fully developed leaves. Okay. So pretty easy to determine when a pod is 3/16 of an inch long, but you've got to have that on 50% of the plants in the field. So, human nature, we go out there and we pull the biggest plant, and there's a pod. So we're in R3. I think we're a little bit early. So I think, another week or so here, we can start pulling the trigger on those fungicide applications, but we've got to be a little careful on that timing. And people say, well, we planted our soybeans early. So, we do this super early planting. So we're going to hit that stage earlier. Well, the studies have shown that we spend an extra 2 weeks in the R2 stage when we plant those beans early. So we're not necessarily hitting that R3 any earlier, or at least not much earlier, just because we planted the beans earlier. They're just getting the benefit of spending more time in the R2 stage, and they put on an extra 2 nodes on average by doing that. So I think still that end of July, 1st of August is probably a closer time frame to hit R3.
Okay. Well, that's good to know there. Like you said, just because you went early doesn't mean you'll hit R3 earlier. Just good for me to hear too. Is you're just spending more time in the R2 stage. So that's very good to know. Like you said, it's important that you're spending time out in that field and making sure that you scouted and you've made that determination to see if you need to apply any fungicides. And obviously the economics are different for everyone, and sometimes they may not justify the need for foliar fungicide if the risk isn't there, or they will, but you won't know until you get out in the field and look. And those listening, if you missed our last podcast, Craig covered some of the criteria and gave some tips on what to look for. We've also linked to this podcast as a video of Craig out there scouting the field too as well. So if you need a little refresher, or maybe you want to get your teenager to go out there and help you out, recommend you check it out. Craig, is there anything else that we're missing or that we need to touch on before we go?
Well, as I think of last year, I think it's just critical that we get prepared for harvest now, and make sure that we're ready, as much as 2-3 weeks earlier than we think we might get in the field. You remember last year we had the tar southern rust here in west central Illinois, east central Iowa. Really shut our crop down early. Just literally killed that corn before it had a chance to finish out, and we were way drier. We started out normally when we'd be 24% moisture, and we were 16.5 maybe. So we had a lot of shatter at the head and everything. So I think it's just critical to make sure you have your harvest equipment ready early. Never know what's going to happen, and it's just good to be ready to pull that trigger. And I think we'll probably spend some time in future podcast, maybe get some more equipment specialists in here and talk about that more in depth.
Absolutely, we definitely will, Craig. Thank you very much for your time, folks. Thank you for those of you that stayed on and listened to us. I appreciate all of you that have been subscribing to us, and hope you have a very wonderful rest of your week or weekend. And don't forget to get out in that field and scout.